Hey guys, tonight we begin with the famous gladiators of ancient Rome. Some won fame, some won fortunes. A lucky few even won their freedom. Most won permanent injuries. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, settle in somewhere comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When people think about gladiators, one name almost always comes first. Spartacus. Not because he fought the most matches, not because he earned the most money, and certainly not because Roman politicians wanted future generations talking about him. If the Roman Senate had its way, Spartacus would have been remembered for approximately 5 minutes before being quietly forgotten forever. Instead, he became the most famous gladiator in history. The irony is that Spartacus became famous largely by refusing to remain a gladiator. He was probably born in Thrace, a rugged region north of Greece known for producing tough warriors. Ancient writers suggest he may have served in the Roman army before his life took a dramatic turn for the worse. Exactly what happened remains unclear. Maybe he deserted. Maybe he rebelled. Maybe he simply made a series of poor career choices. Whatever the reason, he eventually ended up as a slave. From there, things became even less promising. Spartacus was sold to a gladiator school in Capua. This was not a place where ambitious young men went to network and build professional skills. It was a training centre where people learned how to stab one another for public entertainment. Roman crowds loved gladiators. They cheered for them, bet on them, celebrated them, and occasionally demanded their deaths. It was remarkably similar to modern celebrity culture, except with more swords. Most gladiators hoped to survive enough fights to earn their freedom someday. Spartacus looked at the situation and decided someday was taking too long. In 73 before Christ, he joined roughly 70 other gladiators in a daring escape. According to ancient accounts, they seized kitchen utensils and cooking knives before fighting their way out of the school. It remains one of history's few successful prison breaks, launched with equipment borrowed from a cafeteria. The escapees fled toward Mount Vesuvius. Roman authorities initially responded with confidence bordering on laziness. After all, what threat could a few escaped gladiators possibly pose? This assumption would age very poorly. As Spartacus moved through the countryside, runaway slaves, labourers, shepherds, and debt-ridden farmers flocked to his banner. His tiny group quickly became a rebel army. Then the victory started. Roman forces sent to crush the revolt were defeated. Then another force was defeated. Then another. At this point, Roman officials were beginning to experience what modern historians call a serious problem. Each victory attracted more followers. Each defeat embarrassed Rome further. Senators who had once laughed at reports of escaped gladiators suddenly found the situation much less amusing. Nothing ruins a politician's day quite like learning that an army of former slaves keeps defeating professional soldiers. Within 2 years, Spartacus had become the most wanted man in the Roman Republic. His rebellion spread fear across Italy, and Rome was forced to treat him as a genuine military threat, rather than an inconvenience. But there was one thing Spartacus could never escape. Rome could forgive many things. It could forgive military defeats. It could forgive corrupt governors. It could even forgive emperors who made questionable decisions involving horses and government offices. What it could not forgive was humiliation. And for nearly 2 years, a former gladiator had been delivering exactly that. Sooner or later, Rome was going to send everything it had against Spartacus. As Spartacus's rebellion grew larger, he was not alone in leading it. Among his most trusted commanders was a gladiator named Crixus. If Spartacus was the strategist, Crixus was the battering ram. Ancient writers describe him as a Gaul, meaning he came from the Celtic lands north of Italy. Like many gladiators, he had likely been captured during warfare and forced into slavery. Rome had a habit of turning its enemies into entertainment. Sometimes this worked out. Sometimes, as Rome was about to discover, it created highly motivated revolutionaries. Crixus joined Spartacus during the famous escape from Capua and quickly emerged as one of the rebellion's strongest leaders. Strength, however, was only part of his reputation. He was also known for being aggressive, fearless, and perhaps just a little too eager to solve problems with violence. To be fair, he was a gladiator. Diplomacy was not exactly his professional specialty. As the rebel army expanded, tensions began to emerge among its leaders. Spartacus reportedly wanted to march north, cross the Alps, and allow his followers to return to their homelands. This was probably the sensible plan. Unfortunately, sensible plans often struggle when large groups of victorious warriors become involved. Many rebels had spent years suffering under Roman rule. They were no longer interested in simply escaping Italy. They wanted revenge. Crixus appears to have shared that feeling. Instead of following Spartacus north, he separated from the main force with tens of thousands of followers. Ancient sources disagree on the exact numbers, which is hardly surprising since Roman historians occasionally treated statistics as creative writing. What matters is that Crixus commanded a substantial army of his own. At first, confidence was high. After all, they had defeated Roman forces repeatedly. Why should the next battle be any different? This turned out to be the sort of question historians love, because the answer is usually disastrous. In 72 before Christ, Roman forces under the consul Lucius Gellius caught up with Crixus near Mount Garganus in southern Italy. This time, Rome was prepared. The battle was fierce and bloody. Thousands of rebels were killed. Among the dead was Crixus himself. Unlike Spartacus, whose final moments remained surrounded by uncertainty, Crixus almost certainly died fighting on the battlefield. No dramatic surrender, no negotiated escape, no retirement villa overlooking the Mediterranean, just a sword in hand and a hopeless fight against overwhelming odds. For a man who had spent his life charging toward danger, it was perhaps the most predictable ending imaginable. And Spartacus was about to learn that losing Crixus would make Rome's war against the rebels far more personal. While Spartacus became the face of the great slave rebellion, and Crixus earned fame as one of its fiercest commanders, there was another gladiator whose story is often overshadowed by the larger legends. His name was Oenomaus. Unlike Spartacus, whose name survived in countless books and films, Oenomaus is remembered mostly in fragments. Ancient historians left behind only scattered references to him, which is unfortunate because he appears to have been one of the original architects of the rebellion. Then again, Roman writers were not especially eager to celebrate men who spent several years humiliating the Republic. Oenomaus was probably a Gaul, though some sources suggest other origins. Like many gladiators, he was likely captured during one of Rome's endless military campaigns and sold into slavery. The empire had an impressive ability to create its own future problems. After arriving at the gladiator school in Capua, Oenomaus became one of the experienced fighters among the prisoners. By the time Spartacus organized the escape in 73 before Christ, Oenomaus was already a respected veteran. This was important. Escaping a gladiator school was one thing. Keeping dozens of armed fugitives alive while Roman soldiers hunted them was something else entirely. The early rebellion depended on men who understood combat, discipline, and leadership. Oenomaus was one of those men. After the famous breakout, he joined Spartacus and Crixus as part of the rebellion's core leadership. Together, they transformed a desperate escape into a growing military movement. At first, success came surprisingly quickly. Roman commanders treated the rebels as little more than escaped slaves. Several forces were sent to suppress them. Several forces were defeated. This was becoming an embarrassing pattern. However, success also brought danger. As the rebellion expanded, the rebels found themselves facing larger and more experienced Roman armies. Battles became bloodier. Victories became harder. Somewhere during these early campaigns, Oenomaus met his end. The exact details are frustratingly unclear. Ancient sources simply report that he was killed during military operations against Roman forces. No dramatic final speech survives. No heroic last stand was carefully recorded. No poet arrived later to improve the story. History occasionally behaves like a very careless archivist. What we do know is that Oenomaus died before the rebellion reached its greatest size. He never witnessed Spartacus's largest victories. He never saw Rome throw multiple consular armies into the conflict. And he never witnessed the rebellion's final collapse. In a strange way, he was spared the ending. But his death also serves as a reminder that long before Spartacus became a legend, many other gladiators had already paid for the rebellion with their lives, and among them, Oenomaus was one of the first. By the time the rebellion reached its peak, Rome was facing more than a runaway band of slaves. It was facing an army. Among the leaders who emerged during those chaotic years, few possessed the reputation of Gannicus. Ancient sources describe him as a Celt, likely from Gaul. Before joining Spartacus, he had already built a reputation as a gladiator of exceptional skill. Unlike many fighters who entered the arena unwillingly, Gannicus seems to have embraced combat with remarkable confidence. He was exactly the sort of man Roman crowds loved. Fast, fearless, charismatic, and extremely capable of surviving situations that should have killed him. If gladiators had endorsement deals, Gannicus would probably have had several. His fame grew during the slave rebellion, where he became one of its most respected commanders. Alongside Castus, another rebel leader, Gannicus commanded a substantial force that operated independently from Spartacus's main army. This arrangement worked reasonably well at first. The problem with large rebellions, however, is that they tend to become even larger collections of smaller disagreements. As Roman pressure increased, rebel leaders faced difficult choices about strategy. Some wanted to continue fighting. Others wanted to escape Italy. Others likely wanted everyone else to stop arguing and focus on not getting killed. Unfortunately, history rarely records those conversations. In 71 before Christ, the rebellion was beginning to unravel. Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest and most determined commanders, had been given responsibility for ending the revolt. Crassus took the assignment personally, perhaps because repeated defeats by former gladiators were making Rome look ridiculous, perhaps because he simply enjoyed winning. Probably both. During this stage of the war, Gannicus and Castus became separated from Spartacus's main force. Their army was intercepted by Roman troops near Cantenna in southern Italy. The result was disastrous. Ancient accounts suggest that thousands of rebels died in the battle. Among them was Gannicus. Unlike some historical figures whose deaths remain mysterious, Gannicus appears to have died exactly where one would expect a gladiator commander to die. In combat, surrounded by enemies, fighting until the end. Roman writers who generally disliked rebel leaders nevertheless recorded that he fought bravely. That is not praise they handed out casually. For Rome to compliment an enemy usually meant the enemy had made Roman soldiers work very hard for the victory. Gannicus never escaped slavery. He never saw the rebellion succeed. He never lived to enjoy freedom. But his reputation survived long after his death. And among the gladiators who challenged Rome itself, few earned more respect from both sides of the battlefield. Most gladiators dreamed of freedom. It was the prize that made the pain, the injuries, and the constant threat of death seem worthwhile. Fight well enough, survive long enough, and one day you might receive a wooden sword known as a rudis. That simple object represented freedom. For most gladiators, receiving it was the equivalent of winning the lottery. For Flamma, it was apparently something to decline. Repeatedly. Flamma was originally from Syria and entered the arena sometime during the 1st century after Christ. Unlike Spartacus, Gannicus, and the rebel leaders who fought Rome directly, Flamma became famous through the traditional gladiator path. He fought, and fought, and fought some more. His career was so remarkable that his tombstone survived long enough to tell part of his story. According to the inscription, Flamma fought 34 matches. That might not sound extraordinary at first, until you remember that each match involved armed men attempting to solve disagreements through creative stabbing. Of those 34 fights, Flamma won 21. 9 ended in draws, and he lost only 4. Even more impressive, he survived them all. Roman crowds adored him. Arena organizers loved him. His opponents probably had less enthusiastic opinions. The most astonishing detail, however, was not his record, it was his freedom. According to his tombstone, Flamma was offered the rudis 4 separate times. 4 times, and 4 times he refused it. Historians have debated this decision for centuries. Perhaps he enjoyed the fame. Perhaps the rewards of success in the arena were too lucrative to abandon. Perhaps he simply could not imagine another life. Or perhaps he had spent so long fighting that normal civilian existence seemed terrifying. Imagine explaining to your neighbours that your previous occupation involved being chased by heavily armed men, while strangers shouted betting odds. Whatever the reason, Flamma remained a gladiator. Year after year, battle after battle, the arena became his entire world. Unfortunately, even legends have limits. By the age of 30, Flamma finally met the fate that eventually caught almost every gladiator. His tombstone records his death, but frustratingly refuses to explain exactly how it happened. No dramatic details survive. No account of a final duel. No famous opponent. Just the simple fact that after dozens of victories and countless wounds, Flamma died. Perhaps from injuries accumulated over years of combat. Perhaps from a particular fight that finally proved too much. History does not say. What remains remarkable is not how Flamma died. It is how long he managed to avoid dying. In a profession where many men never reached their 3rd fight, Flamma survived 34. And when freedom knocked on his door 4 separate times, he politely answered, "No thanks." A decision that remains either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, depending on which century you're asking from. If Flamma was beloved by the crowds, Spiculus achieved something even more dangerous. He became beloved by an emperor, specifically Nero. Now, being the favourite gladiator of Nero came with certain advantages. Wealth, gifts, fame, and influence could all follow. It was a bit like having the most powerful man in the empire as your personal fan. The downside was that the most powerful man in the empire was Nero, and Nero had a talent for turning everyone around him into a future historical tragedy. Spiculus rose to prominence during the reign of Nero in the 1st century after Christ. Unlike Spartacus or Gannicus, he was not a rebel or military leader. He was exactly what Rome wanted a gladiator to be, an exceptional fighter who entertained the public and enhanced the prestige of the games. His skill in the arena earned him enormous popularity, but it also attracted Nero's attention. The emperor became fascinated with gladiatorial combat. Like many Romans, he admired successful fighters. Unlike most Romans, however, he had the resources of an entire empire available whenever he wanted to express that admiration. Nero rewarded Spiculus lavishly. Ancient writers claim he received estates, luxurious homes, and vast sums of money. For a former gladiator, this represented an extraordinary rise in status. Imagine going from being property to owning more property than many senators. That was Spiculus. As Nero's reign grew increasingly unstable, the emperor's attachment to his favourite gladiator became even more apparent. Then came the crisis of 68 after Christ. Rebellions erupted across the empire. Governors turned against Nero. The Senate abandoned him. Even members of the imperial guard began looking for safer career opportunities. Suddenly, the emperor who ruled the known world found himself almost completely alone. As Nero prepared for his inevitable downfall, ancient sources record a remarkable detail. He reportedly wanted Spiculus to kill him. Not a senator, not a general, not a trusted advisor. His favourite gladiator. Perhaps Nero believed a famous arena champion could provide a noble death. Or perhaps he had simply spent too much time watching gladiatorial spectacles. Unfortunately for Nero, Spiculus could not be found. The emperor eventually took his own life with assistance from a servant. For Spiculus, however, the story was far from over. The political chaos that followed Nero's death proved deadly for many of the emperor's supporters. Men who had prospered under Nero suddenly found themselves associated with a deeply unpopular ruler. Spiculus was one of them. Ancient accounts suggest that he was captured and executed by Nero's enemies shortly after the emperor's fall. No grand arena, no cheering crowd, no glorious duel. After years of surviving combat, before thousands of spectators, Rome's most famous gladiator died as a victim of politics. A fitting reminder that in the Roman Empire, sometimes the most dangerous arena was not the Colosseum. It was the imperial court. Most gladiator stories end in one of two ways: the fighter wins, or the fighter dies. Romans liked their entertainment simple, dramatic, and preferably involving at least one very poor life decision. Priscus, however, managed to become famous because neither of those things happened. His story survives thanks to the poet Martial, who witnessed one of the most extraordinary gladiatorial contests ever held. The year was 80 after Christ. Rome was celebrating the opening of the massive new Flavian amphitheatre, better known today as the Colosseum. Emperor Titus wanted the inaugural games to be unforgettable, and when Roman emperors wanted something memorable, subtlety usually left the room. Thousands of animals were slaughtered, countless spectacles were staged, the greatest gladiators available were summoned. Among them was Priscus. Unfortunately for him, there was another fighter just as skilled. His name was Verus. The two men entered the arena before a packed crowd and began what was expected to be a typical gladiatorial contest. Instead, they produced a performance that became legendary. The fight lasted for hours. Neither man could gain a decisive advantage. Both displayed remarkable courage, endurance, and skill. Again and again, they attacked. Again and again, they defended. Again and again, they somehow avoided becoming the answer to tonight's video's title. As the battle dragged on, the audience became increasingly captivated. This was no longer merely a fight, it was becoming a test of human endurance. Eventually, both gladiators reached the limits of exhaustion, yet neither surrendered, neither fled, neither collapsed. At this point, most Roman spectators were probably wondering whether the combatants secretly intended to fight until the empire itself ran out of funding. Finally, something unprecedented happened. Emperor Titus intervened. Recognizing the extraordinary effort displayed by both men, he declared the contest a draw. This was already a rare honor. Then he went even further. Both gladiators received the wooden sword of freedom. Both men were declared victors. Both left the arena alive. For a gladiator, this was roughly equivalent to winning every prize available simultaneously. Martial later praised Priscus as a model of courage and professionalism, helping preserve his name for future generations. Unfortunately, that is where the historical trail begins to disappear. We know how Priscus achieved immortality. We do not know how he died. There is no surviving account of his final years. No record of a dramatic last battle. No evidence of political intrigue. No suspicious emperor involvement. For historians, this is deeply frustrating. For Priscus, it may have been wonderful. After surviving the most famous draw in gladiatorial history, perhaps he simply lived quietly and died peacefully. And if that happened, he accomplished something that countless gladiators never managed. He escaped the arena, not just alive, but undefeated. If Priscus became famous for refusing to lose, then Verus became famous for exactly the same reason. The two gladiators are forever linked in history. Whenever one name appears, the other usually follows. It's a bit like being remembered as one half of history's most exhausting tie. Verus entered the arena during the grand opening celebrations of the Colosseum in 80 after Christ. Emperor Titus intended the games to showcase the power and glory of Rome. The new amphitheatre was the largest arena the empire had ever built. The message was simple. Rome was wealthy. Rome was powerful. And Rome was willing to spend enormous amounts of money making sure everyone noticed. Among the countless events organised for the occasion, none would become more famous than the duel between Verus and Priscus. Both men were experienced gladiators. Both were highly trained. And both had clearly decided that losing was not part of the day's schedule. According to the poet Martial, who witnessed the event, the fight quickly evolved into something extraordinary. The combatants appeared evenly matched from the beginning. Every attack met a defence. Every opening disappeared before it could be exploited. Every attempt to gain an advantage seemed to fail. The crowd watched as the battle stretched longer and longer. Most gladiatorial contests did not last for hours, for obvious reasons. Fighting while carrying heavy armour and weapons is exhausting enough. Fighting under the Mediterranean sun while thousands of spectators scream at you is even worse. Yet Verus continued. So did Priscus. The two men pushed themselves beyond what most gladiators could endure. As exhaustion mounted, neither fighter showed any willingness to surrender. This was important. Roman audiences respected courage almost as much as they respected violence. Seeing two men continue fighting despite complete exhaustion created a level of drama that no scripted performance could match. Eventually, Emperor Titus made a decision unlike any previously recorded. He declared both gladiators winners. Both received the rudes, the wooden sword symbolizing freedom. Both left the arena alive. And both achieved something incredibly rare. Not every legendary gladiator began life as a slave. Marcus Attilius is one of the most fascinating exceptions. In fact, His story was so unusual that Romans were talking about it centuries before social media could have made things even more unbearable. Most gladiators entered the arena because they had no choice. They were prisoners, slaves, or captives of war. Attilius was different. He appears to have been a free Roman citizen, which raises an obvious question. Why would a free citizen voluntarily become a gladiator? The answer was debt. Ancient Rome had many ways to ruin your finances. Bad harvests, failed business ventures, gambling, political disasters, and unfortunate investments could all destroy a man's fortune. Apparently, Attilius found himself in serious financial trouble. His solution was to become a gladiator. This was roughly the Roman equivalent of solving your mortgage problems by volunteering to wrestle grizzly bears. Most people thought it was a terrible idea. Then Attilius entered the arena and immediately shocked everyone. A surviving mosaic and inscriptions from Pompeii record one of his most famous victories. In his very first fight, Attilius faced a gladiator named Hilarus. This was not supposed to be a fair contest. Hilarus was a veteran. He'd already fought numerous successful matches. He was experienced, respected, and expected to win. Instead, Attilius defeated him. The crowd was stunned. Imagine a complete newcomer walking into a professional sports championship and defeating one of the league's established stars. That was the scale of the surprise. Then Attilius did it again. His next notable opponent was Ratius Felix, another experienced gladiator with an impressive record. Once again, the amateur won. Suddenly, Rome had a new sensation. The free citizen who had entered the arena out of desperation was defeating professionals who had spent years building their reputations. Spectators loved it. People have always enjoyed underdog stories, especially when the underdog is carrying a sword. Unfortunately, this is where history begins to become frustrating. We know Attilius fought. We know he won important victories. We know his achievements were significant enough to be preserved in Pompeii. What we do not know is how he died. No surviving source records his final match. No inscription describes his last days. No dramatic story survived the centuries. It's entirely possible that Attilius eventually earned enough money to solve his financial problems and retire. Imagine that outcome. A man joins the arena because he's broke, survives multiple gladiatorial fights, fixes his finances and walks away alive. Frankly, that might be the most unbelievable story in this entire video. But whether he died in the arena or years afterward, Marcus Attilius left behind one remarkable lesson. Never underestimate a desperate man with debts and a sword. Most gladiators dreamed of becoming emperors. Well, perhaps not emperors specifically. Most would have settled for freedom, a comfortable house, and the ability to go a week without someone trying to stab them. Commodus did things the other way around. He started as emperor and decided he wanted to be a gladiator. This alarmed nearly everyone in Rome. Commodus was the son of the respected emperor Marcus Aurelius, and inherited the throne in 180 after Christ. By birth alone, he possessed wealth, power, and influence beyond imagination. For most people, this would have been enough. Commodus, however, had different ambitions. He became obsessed with gladiatorial combat. At first, Romans tolerated it. Emperors had eccentric hobbies. Some collected exotic animals. Some built extravagant palaces. Commodus preferred entering arenas dressed as a gladiator and demanding applause. The problem was that he wasn't really fighting as a gladiator. A real gladiator entered the arena, knowing death was possible. Commodus entered knowing his opponents were under strict orders not to harm him. This gave him a slight advantage. Roughly the same advantage a lion would have if all the gazelles were instructed to stand still. Ancient writers claim Commodus fought hundreds of contests. He battled gladiators, hunted exotic animals, and presented himself as a living Hercules. According to reports, he once killed dozens of animals from elevated platforms where they could barely threaten him. The spectators applauded enthusiastically, mostly because not applauding an emperor could shorten your life expectancy. Despite the staged nature of these performances, Commodus genuinely believed he was a great gladiator. The Roman elite found this deeply embarrassing. Imagine the ruler of the world's greatest empire spending his time pretending to be something he was not, while demanding everyone praise him for it. Actually, perhaps don't imagine that too hard. As the years passed, Commodus became increasingly erratic. Political purges multiplied. Conspiracies flourished. Members of the Senate began wondering whether the empire was being governed or merely entertained. Eventually, even those closest to him concluded that something had to be done. On the final day of the year 192, a conspiracy was set in motion. First, Commodus was poisoned. Unfortunately for the conspirators, the poison failed. This was awkward. When poison doesn't work, the backup plans tend to become more personal. A wrestler named Narcissus was summoned. He entered Commodus's chambers while the emperor was weakened and strangled him to death in his bath. And so died Rome's most famous imperial gladiator. Not in the arena, not before a cheering crowd, not while dressed as Hercules. After spending years pretending to be a gladiator, Commodus met a fate far more Roman. He was eliminated by a political conspiracy. In the end, the deadliest opponents in Rome were never the men carrying swords in the arena. They were the people standing behind the throne. Not every famous gladiator became a household name like Spartacus. Some were enormously popular in their own time, and then slowly disappeared into the shadows of history, surviving only through fragments of inscriptions, graffiti, and scattered references. One such figure was Bato of Thrace. Today, most people have never heard of him. Had you visited a Roman arena during his lifetime, however, the situation might have been very different. Bato belonged to a category of gladiators known as Thracians, or Thraces. These fighters carried small shields and curved swords, and were modelled after the warriors of Thrace, the same region that had produced Spartacus generations earlier. Roman spectators loved Thracians. Their equipment encouraged fast, aggressive fighting. Matches were often dramatic, unpredictable, and full of movement. In other words, they were excellent entertainment. And entertainment was serious business in Rome. Bato appears in inscriptions that suggest he enjoyed considerable success in the arena. Like modern athletes, successful gladiators built reputations that spread far beyond a single city. Fans discussed their victories. Artists depicted them in mosaics and graffiti. Some women even developed crushes on gladiators. Roman husbands were apparently expected to accept the existence of arena celebrities, with the same frustration experienced by modern husbands when movie stars appear on magazine covers. Bato became one of these celebrated figures. Crowds knew his name. Promoters advertised his appearances. Opponents respected him, which, in the gladiatorial profession, was often a sign that they feared him. Yet despite this popularity, Bato's story contains one of history's most frustrating gaps. We know he fought. We know he won. We know he achieved enough fame to leave traces in the archaeological record. But we do not know exactly how he died. This happened surprisingly often with gladiators. The Romans loved recording victories. The final chapters were sometimes treated as less important. Perhaps Bato died in combat. That would have been the most common outcome. Perhaps he survived long enough to retire and enjoy the rewards of his fame. Successful gladiators could earn substantial wealth, especially those who became crowd favourites. Or perhaps illness eventually claimed him, as it did millions of ordinary Romans whose stories have vanished entirely. History offers no clear answer. What remains is the image of a fighter who once stood before roaring crowds and heard thousands of voices chanting his name. Today, only a few inscriptions remain. It is a reminder that fame can be surprisingly fragile. 1 century, you are the star attraction of the arena. 2,000 years later, historians are still trying to figure out what happened to you. And in Bato's case, Rome never left us the ending. Some gladiators became famous because they won battles. Some became famous because they survived impossible odds. And then there was Celadus. Celadus became famous because he appears to have been the Roman equivalent of a celebrity heartthrob. The evidence comes from the city of Pompeii, where volcanic ash preserved thousands of everyday writings that would normally have disappeared long ago. Among the surviving graffiti are references to a gladiator named Celadus. One inscription describes him as the sigh of the girls, which is probably one of the most flattering reviews any gladiator ever received. Another refers to him as the darling of the girls. Apparently, while other gladiators were busy worrying about swords, shields, and survival, Celadus was unintentionally building a fan club. Or perhaps intentionally. History refuses to clarify. Celadus was likely a murmillo, one of the most recognizable gladiator types in Rome. Murmillos carried large shields and wore distinctive helmets, making them imposing figures in the arena. Despite the intimidating equipment, it seems many spectators were paying attention to something other than his fighting technique. Modern celebrity culture often feels unique. The Romans would have disagreed. They had posters. They had fan admiration. They had public gossip. And they had attractive athletes generating excitement among spectators. The more things change, the more humans remain exactly the same. What makes Celadus fascinating is that his fame survived not because of official records, but because ordinary people wrote about him on walls. Senators left speeches, emperors left monuments. Celadus left women writing compliments in graffiti. Strangely enough, that may be why more people remember him today than countless Roman politicians. Unfortunately, admiration from spectators could not solve every problem. As with many gladiators, the details of Celadus's death have disappeared. No surviving source records his final fight. No inscription tells us when he died. No historian thought to preserve the last chapter of his life. Perhaps he fell in the arena. Perhaps he retired after a successful career. Perhaps he spent years enjoying fame while younger gladiators replaced him in the public imagination. History simply does not know. What survives instead is a snapshot, a glimpse of a man who was once one of Pompeii's biggest celebrities. The volcanic eruption that destroyed Pompeii occurred decades later, preserving the graffiti that mentioned him. In a strange twist of fate, the city that perished helped preserve Celadus's memory. His death remains a mystery, but his reputation survived. And among all the gladiators featured in this story, Celadus may be the only one whose greatest victory was winning over the audience before he even stepped into the arena. Some gladiators became famous because archaeologists found their tombs. Others became famous because graffiti survived on ancient walls. Hermes became famous because a poet could not stop talking about him. That poet was Martial, one of Rome's sharpest observers of public entertainment. When Martial described gladiators, he usually focused on those who had genuinely impressed Roman audiences. Among them, Hermes stood above almost everyone else. In fact, Martial praised him so enthusiastically that modern historians can practically hear the crowd roaring in the background. According to the poet, Hermes possessed every quality a Roman spectator could want. He was skilled, he was courageous, he was versatile, and perhaps most importantly, he was consistently victorious. The arena was full of fighters who could win occasionally. Hermes appears to have been one of those rare competitors who made winning look routine. Roman audiences loved that. Of course, they also loved watching undefeated fighters eventually lose. The Romans were complicated people. Martial described Hermes as a master of multiple fighting styles. This was no small achievement. Gladiators usually specialized in one particular type of combat, spending years perfecting a specific set of weapons and techniques. Hermes, according to the poet, excelled against numerous opponents. Whether every detail is literally true is impossible to know. Poets occasionally exaggerated. Actually, poets frequently exaggerated. If Hermes had successfully tied his sandals, Martial might have compared him to a god. Still, the praise was extraordinary. The fact that Martial devoted so much attention to Hermes suggests he was genuinely one of the greatest arena stars of his generation. Crowds likely flocked to see him perform. Arena organisers probably advertised his appearances heavily. Opponents may have had the unpleasant experience of realising they had been scheduled to fight Rome's favourite gladiator. That realisation alone could ruin a perfectly good morning. Yet despite all this fame, we encounter a familiar problem. Nobody knows exactly how Hermes died. The poet celebrated his victories, the audience remembered his performances, but the final chapter of his life disappeared. Perhaps he died in combat. Even the greatest gladiators eventually made mistakes. Perhaps age caught up with him. Perhaps illness succeeded where countless opponents had failed. History remains silent. In a way, however, that silence says something important. Hermes was remembered not because of how he died. He was remembered because of how he fought. Centuries later, his victories still survive in literature, while the details of his death have faded away. For a gladiator, that may have been the ultimate triumph. And as we approach our final chapter, we'll discover what happened when the gladiators themselves began to disappear from Roman society, ending one of history's most famous professions forever. For centuries, gladiators had been one of the defining symbols of Rome. Emperors sponsored them, crowds adored them, poets celebrated them, merchants sold souvenirs of them. Children probably pretended to be them while annoying their parents. The gladiatorial games were so deeply woven into Roman life that many people could not imagine the empire without them. Yet eventually, the gladiators themselves disappeared. Not in a single dramatic moment, not in one final spectacular battle, but through a slow decline that lasted generations. Ironically, after surviving countless lions, swords, spears, and emperors, the gladiators were ultimately defeated by something far more powerful: changing public opinion. By the 3rd and 4th centuries after Christ, Rome was changing. The empire faced economic troubles, political instability, invasions, and religious transformation. Christianity spread rapidly across the Roman world, bringing new attitudes toward public violence and blood sport. Many Christian leaders condemned gladiatorial combat. To them, the games represented cruelty rather than entertainment. This did not immediately end the spectacles. Romans had been enjoying arena combat for hundreds of years and were not eager to give it up overnight. Human beings rarely abandon their favourite entertainment quickly. Just ask anyone trying to spend less time looking at their phone. The games continued, but enthusiasm gradually weakened. The empire itself was becoming poorer and less stable. Hosting large gladiatorial spectacles was expensive. Training fighters, Maintaining arenas and organising events required enormous resources. Increasingly, those resources were needed elsewhere. Then came one of the most famous stories connected to the end of gladiatorial combat. According to later accounts, a monk named Telemachus entered an arena during a gladiatorial contest and attempted to stop the fighting. The crowd reacted violently, very violently. The monk was killed. However, his death reportedly shocked Emperor Honorius, who soon moved to prohibit gladiatorial games entirely. Whether every detail of the story is true remains debated by historians. What is certain is that gladiatorial combat largely disappeared during the early 5th century. The last known gladiatorial contests took place around 404 after Christ. After nearly 7 centuries, the profession was gone. The arenas remained, the stories remained, the legends remained, but the gladiators themselves had vanished. Spartacus, Crixus, Gannicus, Flamma, Priscus, Verus, Hermes, and countless others whose names have been lost to history. Some died in battle, some died in rebellion, some died in obscurity. A few may even have died peacefully, which was probably the greatest upset victory any gladiator ever achieved. And so ended the age of the Roman gladiators, not with the clash of swords, but with the slow fading of a world that no longer wanted them. For men who spent their lives fighting before roaring crowds, history's final verdict was surprisingly quiet. Long before the pilgrim ever saw the mountains of northern Spain or the towers of Santiago, the journey began at home. For most medieval people, travel was not something done for pleasure. There were no guidebooks promising hidden gems, no comfortable inns waiting every few miles, and certainly no one recommending a 600-mile walk as a refreshing break from daily life. Most people spent their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. Leaving home for months, or even years, was a serious decision. Yet thousands chose to do exactly that. The destination was Santiago de Compostela, believed to house the remains of St. James the Apostle. By the High Middle Ages, it had become one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in Christendom, alongside Rome and Jerusalem. Reaching it was considered an act of devotion, capable of bringing spiritual rewards, forgiveness of sins, and a deeper connection to God. The reasons for setting out varied from person to person. Some pilgrims walked willingly, seeking spiritual growth or giving thanks for surviving illness, war, or famine. Others made promises during desperate moments. A man might vow to visit Santiago if his child recovered from a fever. A widow might undertake the journey after losing a loved one. A knight could travel seeking forgiveness for violence committed during war. Not everyone went entirely by choice. Courts occasionally assigned pilgrimages as punishment for certain crimes. Instead of sitting in a prison cell, an offender might be ordered to walk hundreds of miles, carrying proof of his journey. Medieval justice occasionally displayed a surprising confidence in blisters as a corrective measure. Preparations often took weeks. A pilgrim gathered sturdy clothing, a cloak, a walking staff, and a leather pouch. Many carried the traditional broad-brimmed hat that offered some protection from rain and sun. Family members helped prepare supplies, while neighbours gathered to offer blessings and prayers. There was also the difficult matter of saying goodbye. No traveller could be certain of returning. Roads were dangerous, disease was common, and accidents could happen almost anywhere. Some pilgrims drafted wills before leaving. Others settled debts and arranged for relatives to manage their property in their absence. Then came the morning of departure. With a small bundle over one shoulder and uncertainty stretching farther than the road itself, the pilgrim stepped away from familiar fields, familiar faces, and familiar routines. Ahead lay forests, mountains, strangers, hardships, and hopes. The road to Santiago had begun. The first days on the road were often the strangest. For weeks, perhaps months, a pilgrim had imagined this moment. The journey to Santiago seemed noble when discussed beside a warm hearth. It sounded inspiring during sermons. It even felt manageable while looking at a map drawn by someone who had never actually walked the route. Reality arrived quickly. A pilgrim soon discovered that walking all day was different from walking across a village to buy bread. Feet ached. Shoulders complained about carrying supplies. Boots rubbed against skin in ways that felt deeply personal. By the second or third day, many travellers were already questioning decisions that had seemed perfectly reasonable at home. Fortunately, few pilgrims travelled entirely alone. Across Europe, major routes gradually formed as thousands of travellers headed toward the same destination. From France, Germany, England, Italy and beyond, streams of pilgrims merged into larger groups. Roads that seemed empty one day might be filled with travellers the next. These routes became known collectively as the Camino. Along the way, a pilgrim encountered people from every level of society. There were peasants walking in simple wool clothing, merchants carrying letters and goods, monks seeking spiritual reflection, nobles travelling with servants, and veterans hoping that a very long walk might help settle old burdens carried in their minds. Conversations often began with a simple question. "Where are you from?" The answers could reveal places hundreds of miles apart. One traveller might speak a familiar dialect, while another sounded almost impossible to understand. Medieval Europe was deeply connected by faith, yet divided by countless languages, customs and local traditions. Still, the road created its own community. Pilgrims shared food, exchanged stories, and warned one another about difficult crossings ahead. News travelled surprisingly fast through these wandering networks. Travellers learned which bridges were damaged, which inns were crowded, and which towns offered the best hospitality. Not every companion proved trustworthy, of course. The pilgrimage attracted honest travellers, but it also attracted opportunists. A road filled with strangers carrying money was an irresistible invitation for thieves, swindlers, and individuals whose relationship with morality was flexible at best. Yet despite the hardships, many pilgrims felt a growing sense of purpose. Each step carried them farther from ordinary life. The concerns of home slowly faded behind them. The road stretched forward, winding through fields, forests, and distant hills. For the first time, Santiago no longer felt like an idea. It felt like a place that might actually be reached. As the pilgrim routes converged in southern France, a formidable obstacle appeared on the horizon: the Pyrenees. Stretching between France and the Iberian Peninsula, these mountains marked one of the most challenging sections of the journey to Santiago. For many pilgrims, this would be the first truly serious test of endurance. Up to this point, the road had been difficult. Beyond the mountains, it would become demanding. The peaks rose ahead like a stone wall separating one world from another. Pilgrims approaching the crossing often spent a final night in the foothills, gathering supplies and listening to advice from travellers returning in the opposite direction. Some stories were encouraging, others sounded suspiciously like warnings disguised as stories. Everyone seemed to know someone who had nearly frozen, lost their way, broken an ankle, or encountered a storm at the worst possible moment. The next morning, the climb began. Paths wound upward through forests of pine and beech. The air grew cooler with every mile. Villages became scarce, replaced by rocky slopes and distant valleys. Travellers who had spent their lives on flat farmland suddenly found themselves confronting terrain that appeared to have been designed specifically to discourage walking. Progress slowed considerably. A road that might allow 20 miles of travel on level ground often yielded only a fraction of that in the mountains. Pilgrims paused frequently to catch their breath, adjust their loads, or simply stare at the endless climb ahead. Weather added another layer of difficulty. A clear morning could transform into cold rain by afternoon. Dense fog sometimes rolled across the passes, reducing visibility to only a few yards. In winter or early spring, snow could linger on higher routes, making crossings dangerous or impossible. Yet the mountains also offered moments of remarkable beauty. Pilgrims looked down upon valleys dotted with tiny farms and churches. Eagles circled overhead. Streams rushed through deep ravines below. For travellers accustomed to seeing the same fields year after year, the landscape seemed almost otherworldly. The crossing was not merely physical. Many pilgrims viewed the Pyrenees as a symbolic threshold. Behind them lay home, familiarity, and the life they had always known. Ahead lay Spain, the long road westward, and the sacred destination that had drawn them from across Europe. When the highest passes were finally behind them, relief spread through the weary travellers. The descent revealed new valleys, new towns, and a new country. Spain lay before them. Santiago was still hundreds of miles away, but one thing was now certain. They were truly committed. Turning back no longer seemed easier than continuing forward. Once the Pyrenees were behind them, pilgrims settled into a routine that would define much of the journey. Wake before sunrise. Walk. Stop briefly to eat. Walk again. Then continue walking until the fading light finally gave permission to stop. The romance of pilgrimage often disappeared somewhere around the 10th consecutive day of sore feet. A typical pilgrim rose at dawn, or even earlier. The morning air was cool, and travellers wanted to cover as much distance as possible before the heat of the afternoon arrived. Breakfast, when available, was usually simple. Bread, cheese, dried fruit, or leftover food from the previous evening were common choices. Nobody was posting photographs of these meals and describing them as life-changing culinary experiences. Then came the road. Hour after hour, pilgrims moved through fields, forests, and open countryside. Some walked alone in quiet reflection. Others joined groups where stories, prayers, gossip, and complaints helped pass the time. There was no shortage of complaints. Feet developed blisters. Boots wore out. Rain-soaked clothing. Summer sun baked travellers for hours. Dust settled onto faces and cloaks. Even the healthiest pilgrims discovered muscles they had never previously noticed. Yet daily life on the Camino was not entirely unpleasant. The road offered constant variety. One day might pass through vineyards stretching across rolling hills. The next could lead through oak forests alive with birdsong. Travellers crossed rivers, climbed ridges, and entered villages that seemed untouched by the outside world. Every evening brought a search for shelter. Pilgrims hoped to find space in a monastery, hospice, inn, or charitable guest house. The fortunate secured a bed. The less fortunate found a patch of floor. The truly unlucky slept outdoors while convincing themselves that the cold was somehow spiritually beneficial. Privacy was almost non-existent. Dormitories were crowded. Travellers from different countries slept side by side. Snoring echoed through shared rooms with remarkable enthusiasm. A pilgrim seeking silence often discovered that medieval accommodations treated silence as an optional luxury. Despite the discomfort, strong bonds formed. After walking together for days or weeks, companions became familiar friends. They shared meals, helped one another through illness, and exchanged stories about the lives they had left behind. Gradually, the road itself became home. The concerns that had once seemed urgent back in distant villages began to fade. What mattered now was reaching the next town, finding water, preserving one's boots, and making steady progress westward. Tomorrow would look much like today. And strangely enough, many pilgrims found comfort in that rhythm. By the time a pilgrim had spent several weeks on the road, one simple truth became obvious. The journey to Santiago would have been nearly impossible without the countless places that offered shelter along the way. Every evening, as the sun began sinking toward the horizon, attention shifted from walking to finding a place to sleep. A pilgrim who delayed this task too long might discover that every available bed had already been claimed by travellers who possessed the rare and valuable skill of arriving earlier. Across the Camino, monasteries played a vital role. Many religious communities welcomed pilgrims as part of their Christian duty. Some offered food, beds, medical care, and spiritual guidance. Others provided only the basics: a roof, a place to rest, and perhaps a bowl of soup that looked as though it had been contemplating existence for several days. Most pilgrims accepted such meals gratefully. After walking 20 miles, culinary standards became remarkably flexible. Monasteries were often among the safest places to stay. Travellers attended evening prayers, shared simple meals, and rested within sturdy stone walls. For a brief moment, the hardships of the road seemed distant. Not all accommodations were run by monks. In larger towns, inns catered to travellers of every kind. These establishments varied enormously. Some were comfortable and well managed. Others appeared to operate under the theory that if the roof remained attached to the building, all other concerns were secondary. Pilgrims learned to lower expectations. A soft bed was rare. Clean sheets were even rarer. Fleas frequently considered themselves paying guests. Yet a crowded inn still offered warmth, companionship, and protection from rain. One of the most important institutions along the route was the Pilgrim Hospital. The medieval word hospital did not necessarily mean a modern medical facility. These establishments often combined lodging, charity, and healthcare. Sick or injured pilgrims could receive treatment, food, and a chance to recover before continuing their journey. Such places saved countless lives. The Camino was physically demanding, and many travellers arrived exhausted, malnourished, or suffering from illness. Without these charitable institutions, many would never have reached Santiago. Evenings became a special time on the road. Pilgrims gathered around fires, exchanged stories, compared routes, and discussed what lay ahead. Friendships formed between people who might never have met under ordinary circumstances. Then night settled over the roads of Spain. Candles flickered. Conversations faded. Snoring gradually conquered the dormitories. And as hundreds of weary travellers drifted to sleep, the road waited patiently outside, ready to summon them forward once again at dawn. The road to Santiago was filled with churches, monasteries, and charitable hosts. It was also filled with danger. Medieval pilgrims understood this from the moment they left home. A journey of hundreds of miles across mountains, forests, and unfamiliar territories carried risks that could not be avoided. Every traveller knew someone who had set out on a pilgrimage and never returned. Sometimes the reason was simple bad luck. A twisted ankle on a rocky path could become a serious problem. A broken leg in a remote valley might leave a traveller stranded far from help. Even a minor injury could grow dangerous when weeks of walking prevented proper recovery. Illness was an even greater threat. Pilgrims travelled through crowded inns, busy markets, and packed dormitories where disease spread easily. A cough that seemed harmless one evening might become a life-threatening fever days later. Medieval medicine had its limitations, and those limitations often became painfully clear at inconvenient moments. Then there were the roads themselves. Many routes passed through dense forests where travellers could become lost. Poor weather sometimes obscured paths entirely. Heavy rain transformed roads into muddy traps. Rivers swelled unexpectedly, making crossings dangerous. A pilgrim could survive weeks of walking, only to discover that a bridge had collapsed the day before arrival. Bandits presented another concern. Not every traveller on the Camino was seeking spiritual enlightenment. Some individuals preferred a simpler profession, taking money from pilgrims who had already carried it hundreds of miles for them. Remote stretches of road were particularly risky. Travellers often joined groups for protection, knowing that thieves generally preferred isolated victims. A lone pilgrim carrying coins, food, and personal belongings was an attractive target. Fortunately, stories of bandits sometimes exceeded reality. Medieval people enjoyed sharing dramatic tales. Around evening fires, a single highway robber could quickly become an entire army of villains. By the third retelling, listeners might reasonably expect dragons to appear. Still, the danger remained real. Wild animals also worried some travellers. Wolves occasionally roamed certain regions, though attacks on groups were uncommon. The fear of encountering wolves often exceeded the actual likelihood, but fear rarely concerns itself with statistics. Perhaps the greatest challenge was uncertainty. Pilgrims rarely knew what awaited them beyond the next hill or forest. Every day brought unfamiliar people, changing conditions, and unexpected obstacles. Yet despite these dangers, the road remained crowded. Thousands continued towards Santiago year after year. The risks were significant, but so was the determination of those who believed the journey was worth every hardship. For them, the dangers were not reasons to turn back. They were simply part of the pilgrimage itself. After days of walking through forests, farmland, and isolated roads, few sights lifted a pilgrim's spirits more than the appearance of a town on the horizon. The sight usually meant three important things: food, shelter, and a temporary break from walking. Throughout northern Spain, many towns prospered because of the constant flow of pilgrims heading towards Santiago. What had once been small settlements gradually expanded into thriving communities filled with merchants, craftsmen, innkeepers, and religious institutions eager to serve the thousands of travellers passing through each year. For local residents, pilgrims brought opportunity. A traveller needed meals, lodging, shoes, repairs, supplies, and occasionally medical care. Every arriving pilgrim represented business. Medieval towns along the Camino quickly learned that welcoming visitors could be remarkably profitable. As pilgrims entered through the town gates, they encountered bustling streets unlike anything found on the open road. Market stalls lined public squares. Bakers sold fresh loaves still warm from the oven. Butchers displayed cuts of meat. Merchants offered clothing, tools, candles, rosaries and souvenirs for travellers hoping to return home with proof that they had actually completed the journey rather than merely talking about it. The sounds alone could be overwhelming. Church bells rang from towers overhead. Merchants called out to customers. Horses clattered across stone streets. Children ran through crowded alleys. After days of listening mostly to birds and wind, the noise of a medieval town could feel almost shocking. Pilgrims often spent several hours exploring before seeking accommodations. Many visited local churches to pray and attend Mass. Others searched for supplies to replace worn equipment. Boots frequently needed repair after hundreds of miles of punishment. Walking staffs broke, cloaks tore. The road showed little mercy to possessions. The towns also became places of cultural exchange. Travellers from across Europe met residents and fellow pilgrims from distant lands. Languages mixed together in marketplaces and taverns. Stories travelled almost as quickly as the pilgrims themselves. News from France, England, Italy, Germany, and Spain spread along these roads through countless conversations. Not everything was pleasant, of course. Crowded towns sometimes attracted pickpockets and swindlers. Prices occasionally rose when merchants spotted obvious pilgrims. A traveller who appeared wealthy might suddenly discover that every item in town had become mysteriously expensive. Even so, most pilgrims welcomed these stops. The towns provided moments of comfort and human connection amid the hardships of the road. And after a night of rest behind sturdy walls, the familiar routine would begin again. At dawn, the road westward would call once more. After weeks or even months on the road, something began to change. The conversations around evening fires became different. The distances between towns seemed shorter. Every milestone attracted more attention. Pilgrims who had once focused only on surviving the next day now found themselves thinking constantly about the destination. Santiago was finally close. Not close by modern standards, of course. Medieval pilgrims still had many miles ahead of them. But after crossing mountains, enduring storms, and wearing down several layers of shoe leather, the end of the journey no longer felt like a distant dream. It felt real. The closer travellers came to Santiago, the more crowded the roads became. New groups joined the route from nearby regions. Pilgrims who had travelled separately for weeks gradually merged into larger streams moving steadily westward. There was a growing sense of anticipation. Many travellers had imagined this moment for years. Some had saved money and prepared for the pilgrimage long before departure. Others had made solemn vows during moments of crisis and were now approaching the fulfillment of those promises. Yet the final stage was often emotionally complicated. Exhaustion lingered. Feet still hurt. The road still climbed hills with remarkable enthusiasm. Pilgrims woke each morning with aching muscles and tired bodies. Reaching Santiago suddenly felt both incredibly near and frustratingly far. The cathedral might be only days away, but those days still required walking. A great deal of walking. Some travellers became unusually quiet during these final miles. The journey had provided endless opportunities for reflection. Long hours on the road encouraged thoughts about family, faith, mistakes, hopes, and the future. As Santiago approached, many pilgrims looked back on everything they had experienced since leaving home. The person arriving was often not quite the same person who had departed. Along the route, pilgrims also encountered monuments and churches connected to the pilgrimage itself. These landmarks reminded them that countless others had followed the same roads for generations. Kings, peasants, merchants, monks, and soldiers had all passed this way. The road carried memories as well as travellers. Then came one of the most famous moments of the entire pilgrimage. From certain high points along the route, pilgrims could catch their first glimpse of the distant towers of Santiago. For many, it was an unforgettable sight. Some prayed, some wept, some simply stared in silence. After months of uncertainty, hardship, and perseverance, the goal was finally visible. The journey was almost over. Only a few more miles remained between the weary pilgrims and the city they had crossed half of Europe to reach. At last, after countless miles of roads, mountains, forests, villages, storms, and aching feet, the pilgrims arrived. The city of Santiago de Compostela stood before them. For many travellers, this was the moment they had imagined since the day they left home. Some had spent months on the road. Others had travelled for nearly a year. They had crossed entire kingdoms, slept in crowded dormitories, survived difficult weather, and worn through boots that probably deserved honorary recognition for their service. Now, the journey's destination was finally real. As pilgrims approached the city gates, excitement spread through the crowds. The roads leading into Santiago were often busy with fellow travellers arriving from different directions. Some walked with renewed energy despite their exhaustion. Others moved slowly, determined to savour every remaining step. Then came the first full view of the cathedral. Its towers rose above the city, visible from streets crowded with merchants, clergy, residents, and visitors. For medieval pilgrims, this was one of the most important religious sites in the Christian world. The sight alone could provoke powerful emotions. Many pilgrims fell to their knees. Others offered prayers of thanks. Some simply stared in silence, struggling to believe they had actually reached their destination. Inside the city, the atmosphere was unlike anything found along the road. Streets bustled with activity. Vendors sold food and souvenirs. Church bells echoed through the air. Pilgrims from across Europe filled the squares and narrow lanes. At the heart of it all stood the great cathedral. The primary goal of the pilgrimage was to visit the shrine believed to contain the relics of St. James the Apostle. Travellers entered the cathedral carrying months of anticipation. Many attended Mass, confessed their sins, and prayed before the shrine. Long before Rome marched into Gaul with its legions, roads, taxes, and strong opinions about how everyone else should live, thousands of Gauls woke each morning in villages scattered across forests, river valleys, and rolling farmland. As dawn breaks over the countryside, the village slowly comes to life. A thin mist hangs over the fields beyond the settlement. Smoke begins rising from holes in thatched roofs as household fires are rekindled after the night. Dogs bark somewhere in the distance. Roosters announce the morning with complete confidence, despite having made the same announcement yesterday and receiving no promotion for their efforts. The village itself is modest but busy. A wooden palisade surrounds many settlements, offering protection against raiders, rival tribes, and anyone else who arrives carrying a spear and bad intentions. The wall is not an enormous fortress, but it provides reassurance. In an age without police stations, emergency phone numbers, or neighbourhood watch groups, a sturdy fence is often the next best thing. Inside the enclosure stand several wooden houses clustered around open spaces and pathways worn by years of foot traffic. The homes are built from timber frames packed with woven branches and clay. Their thick thatched roofs shed rain and help keep warmth inside during cold winters. Most families share their homes with more than just relatives. Animals are often housed nearby or under the same roof during harsh weather. A family's wealth can frequently be measured not by coins, but by the number of cattle, sheep, pigs, or goats they own. Livestock are savings accounts with legs. As sunlight spreads across the village, people emerge from their homes. Women begin preparing the first meal of the day. Men inspect animals and gather tools needed for work. Children help with chores before they are old enough to complain effectively about them. Elderly villagers, carrying decades of experience, observe the activity around them and offer advice whether anyone requested it or not. The smell of wood smoke drifts through the air. Nearby, blacksmiths prepare their forges. Farmers discuss the day's work. Traders passing through may already be unloading goods brought from distant regions. Although the village appears quiet compared to a Roman city, it is far from idle. Every person has responsibilities. Every season brings new tasks. and every sunrise marks the beginning of another day in a world governed by farming, family, and tradition. For the Gauls, life moved with the rhythms of nature, and the village was the centre of everything they knew. As the village fully awakens and people scatter to their daily tasks, it becomes easier to notice the buildings that form the heart of the settlement. A Gaulish village is, above all else, a community built from wood. Unlike the stone cities that would later be favoured by the Romans, most Gaulish homes rely on materials gathered from the surrounding landscape. Forests provide timber, riverbanks provide clay, and fields provide straw for roofing. Nearly everything needed to build a house can be found within a short walk of the village. Construction begins with sturdy wooden posts driven deep into the ground. These form the skeleton of the house. Between them, builders weave flexible branches together to create walls. The woven structure is then covered with a mixture of clay, mud, and straw. Once dried, the walls become surprisingly durable and provide protection from wind and rain. Above everything rises a thick thatched roof. Made from reeds or straw, the roof extends beyond the walls to help keep water away from the structure. From a distance, these roofs give the village a soft, rounded appearance, as if the houses have grown naturally from the landscape itself. Inside, life revolves around a single feature: the hearth. Located near the centre of the home, the fire provides warmth, light, and a place for cooking. Its smoke escapes through openings in the roof, though not always efficiently. A visitor entering a Gaulish house might immediately notice the smell of smoke lingering in the air and the darkened beams overhead. The family spends much of its day around this fire. Meals are prepared here. Stories are told here. During winter, much of daily life takes place within its comforting glow. The hearth is not merely a practical necessity. It is the centre of the household. Furniture is simple. Wooden benches, stools, chests, and tables provide the essentials. Animal skins and wool blankets offer bedding. There is little clutter because every item serves a purpose. Decorative objects exist, but practicality usually takes priority. Several generations often share the same dwelling. Parents, children, grandparents, and relatives may all live under one roof. Privacy, as modern people understand it, is almost non-existent. If someone wanted a quiet room to themselves, they would likely need to invent the concept first. Yet these homes are far from primitive shelters. They are carefully designed, well suited to the local climate, and built by people with generations of experience. For the Gauls, a house is more than wood and clay. It is the place where family, work, and daily life come together beneath a single roof. If the hearth was the centre of the Gaulish home, then the fields surrounding the village were the centre of survival. Every morning, shortly after sunrise, much of the village headed beyond the wooden palisade and into the farmland that sustained the community. The success or failure of these fields determined whether a village prospered, struggled, or faced the grim possibility of hunger during the coming winter. For most Gauls, farming was not simply an occupation. It was life itself. The landscape around a typical village was divided into cultivated fields, grazing land, and patches of woodland. Generations of farmers had learned which soils produced the best harvests and which areas were better left for livestock. The principal crops included wheat, barley, millet, and oats. These grains formed the foundation of the Gaulish diet. Bread, porridge, and ale all depended upon successful harvests. Villagers also grew beans, peas, turnips, cabbages, and other vegetables that added variety to meals that could otherwise become remarkably repetitive. A poor harvest could turn that repetition into scarcity. The tools used by Gaulish farmers were simple but effective. Wooden ploughs, often reinforced with iron fittings cut through the soil. Sickles harvested grain. Hoes broke up weeds. Much of the work relied upon human effort, assisted by oxen powerful enough to pull heavy loads across the fields. The labour was relentless. In spring, fields had to be prepared and planted. Summer brought maintenance and constant attention to crops. Autumn was dominated by the harvest, the most critical period of the agricultural year. Winter provided some relief, but even then there were repairs to make, animals to care for, and preparations for the next growing season. Weather ruled over everything. A warm spring could promise abundance. A late frost could destroy young crops. Too much rain flooded fields. Too little rain dried them out. Farmers spent their lives negotiating with forces completely beyond their control. Sometimes nature cooperated. Sometimes nature behaved like an impatient tribal chief determined to make everyone's life more difficult. The entire village participated in agricultural work. Men, women, and children all contributed according to their abilities. During harvest season, nearly everyone was involved. Grain had to be gathered quickly before storms, animals, or spoilage could claim it. When the work was finally complete, barns and storage pits filled with precious supplies. Each sack of grain represented security. Each successful harvest meant another year of survival. And as villagers looked across the fields, stretching beyond their homes, they understood a simple truth. Everything they possessed ultimately began with the land. While crops filled the fields around the village, another form of wealth could be heard long before it was seen. The lowing of cattle, the grunting of pigs, the bleating of sheep. For the Gauls, livestock were among the most valuable possessions a family could own. Animals provided food, clothing, labour, and status. A person's herd often revealed more about their prosperity than any collection of coins ever could. As the morning's farming work began, many villagers turned their attention to the animals. Cattle were particularly prized. Large herds represented wealth and influence throughout much of Gaul. Cows supplied milk, calves strengthened future herds, and oxen provided the muscle needed to pull ploughs and wagons. In many ways, cattle were the engines of the ancient village economy. A wealthy chieftain might own dozens or even hundreds of animals. An ordinary farmer was often grateful for a handful. Pigs were equally important, though for different reasons. Unlike cattle, pigs could forage in nearby forests, feeding on acorns, roots, and fallen nuts. They required less supervision and reproduced quickly. Most importantly, they provided a reliable source of meat. A village without pigs was possible. A village that wanted to eat well generally preferred not to experiment with the idea. Sheep and goats added further resources. Their wool could be spun into clothing and blankets. Their milk supplemented diets throughout the year. Goats, in particular, earned a reputation for surviving in conditions that would make other animals reconsider their career choices. Much of the responsibility for livestock care fell upon the entire family. Children often helped herd animals to grazing areas. Teenagers watched over flocks. Adults repaired fences, treated injuries, and ensured animals had access to water. The work never truly stopped. Predators posed a constant threat. Wolves still roamed many parts of Gaul. A poorly guarded flock could suffer losses during the night. Theft was another concern. Livestock were valuable enough to attract attention from dishonest neighbours or rival groups. Disease worried villagers as well. A sickness spreading through a herd could destroy years of careful breeding and investment. Without modern veterinary medicine, experience and luck often became the primary tools available. By evening, animals gradually returned to the settlement. The sounds of the village changed as herds entered pens and enclosures. Families counted livestock, checked for injuries, and prepared for another day. To an outsider, these animals might seem ordinary. To the Gauls, they represented food, security, wealth, and survival. A successful village depended not only on the crops growing in its fields, but also on the creatures grazing beside them. After a long day spent in the fields and tending livestock, attention gradually shifted toward one of the most important moments in village life: the evening meal. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, smoke began rising from the houses once again. Families gathered around their hearths, where much of Gaulish domestic life unfolded. The fire that warmed the home throughout the year also served as its kitchen, dining room, and social centre. For most villagers, food was simple but filling. The foundation of the diet came from the crops grown in nearby fields. Grain was ground into flour and baked into coarse bread or boiled into thick porridge. Barley and wheat were especially important, appearing on tables so frequently that many villagers probably stopped discussing them altogether. When something appears in nearly every meal, it eventually becomes less exciting and more reliable. Vegetables provided variety: beans, peas, onions, turnips, cabbages, and leeks commonly appeared in soups and stews. These dishes simmered for hours in clay pots suspended above the fire. A single pot might feed an entire family while using ingredients gathered from fields, gardens, and nearby woodlands. Meat was available, though not always in large quantities. Pork was particularly common, thanks to the abundance of pigs raised throughout Gaul. Beef was usually reserved for special occasions, because cattle were too valuable alive. Sheep, goats, poultry, and wild game occasionally supplemented the diet. Hunters sometimes returned with deer, wild boar, rabbits, or birds. A successful hunt could transform an ordinary meal into a memorable feast. The surrounding forests offered additional resources. Villagers gathered nuts, berries, mushrooms, and wild herbs. Honey was especially prized, serving as one of the few readily available sweeteners. Children likely enjoyed helping collect such foods, particularly when the task involved eating some of the harvest before arriving home. Not every generation invented that habit. Drinks were equally important. Water was available, but many people also consumed ale brewed from grain. In some regions, imported wine reached wealthier households through trade networks. Possessing wine from distant lands was a useful way to demonstrate status while reminding everyone that you could afford something they could not. Meals were more than opportunities to eat. They were moments when families gathered together after a day of labour. Stories were shared, plans were discussed. Elders passed down traditions and advice. Children listened, learned, and occasionally attempted to avoid chores. As darkness settled over the village, the hearth remained the centre of activity. Tomorrow would bring another demanding day, but for now, food, warmth, and family were enough. Once the evening meal was finished and the day's farming tasks were complete, it might be tempting to imagine the villagers relaxing until sunrise. The village blacksmith would strongly disagree. Not everyone in a Gaulish settlement spent their days farming. Although agriculture formed the foundation of village life, every community depended upon skilled craftspeople whose work kept daily life functioning. Without them, fields could not be ploughed, houses could not be repaired, and tools would gradually become little more than expensive pieces of broken metal. Among the most respected craftsmen was the blacksmith. His forge was one of the busiest places in the village. Here, iron was heated until it glowed orange and yellow before being hammered into tools, knives, nails, horseshoes, spearheads, and farming equipment. The sound of metal striking metal echoed throughout the settlement. A village might tolerate many inconveniences, but a broken plough during planting season was not one of them. Woodworkers were equally important. Using axes, adzes, and chisels, they crafted carts, furniture, storage chests, bowls, handles, fences, and countless other necessities. In a society where wood was everywhere, skilled carpenters rarely lacked work. Potters also played a vital role. Clay gathered from nearby rivers was shaped into cooking pots, storage jars, cups, and bowls. These items were essential for storing grain, preparing food, and carrying water. A family with no pottery quickly discovered how difficult daily life became. Women often contributed through spinning and weaving. Wool from sheep was cleaned, spun into thread, and woven into cloth. Clothing did not appear magically in a market stall. Every garment represented many hours of labour. A torn cloak meant extra work, not a quick shopping trip. Trade connected villages to the wider world. Merchants travelled along rivers and roads carrying goods from distant regions. Salt was particularly valuable, helping preserve food throughout the year. Fine metalwork, jewellery, wine, and luxury goods occasionally reached wealthier members of society through these networks. Sometimes exotic items appeared that had travelled astonishing distances. A trader might arrive carrying goods from lands most villagers would never see. Such visitors brought not only merchandise but also stories, rumours, and news from beyond the local countryside. The marketplace became a gathering point where business and conversation mixed freely. Deals were negotiated, friendships maintained, and local gossip exchanged with remarkable efficiency. By sunset, the sounds of hammers and bargaining gradually faded. The workshops closed, the merchants settled for the night, and the village prepared for another day, supported not only by farmers and livestock, but by the skilled hands that transformed raw materials into the tools of everyday life. The work of farming, herding, building and trading filled most days in a Gaulish village. But life was not entirely devoted to labour. The Gauls lived in a world they believed was filled with spirits, sacred places, and unseen forces that influenced everything from harvests to battles. Religion was woven into daily life so completely that it was difficult to separate the sacred from the ordinary. The natural world itself held deep significance. Forests, rivers, springs, and groves could all be considered holy. Certain locations were believed to possess special spiritual importance, becoming places where offerings were made and ceremonies performed. A quiet grove of oak trees might be viewed with far greater respect than an impressive building. In many cases, sacred spaces were found in nature rather than constructed by human hands. At the centre of religious life stood the Druids. The Druids were far more than priests. They served as judges, teachers, advisors, historians, and guardians of sacred traditions. Their knowledge was highly respected, and their influence often extended across multiple tribes. Young Druids trained for years, memorizing enormous amounts of information. In a society where much knowledge was passed down orally, memory was one of the most valuable skills a person could possess. A Druid's education required dedication that would make many modern students suddenly appreciate shorter homework assignments. Villagers consulted Druids on important matters. Disputes could be settled through their judgment. Religious ceremonies were conducted under their guidance. They preserved traditions and helped maintain social order within the community. Throughout the year, festivals marked the changing seasons. These celebrations brought entire communities together. Farming societies paid close attention to the rhythms of nature, and important points in the agricultural calendar were often accompanied by feasting, ceremonies, and gatherings. One festival might celebrate the beginning of summer. Another could mark the approach of winter, Bonfires illuminated the night sky. Families gathered to share food and drink. Musicians played while stories were told around the fire. Communities strengthened social bonds through shared celebrations. These events provided welcome relief from the demands of daily labour. For a few days, attention shifted away from fields and livestock toward music, feasting, and tradition. Religion also offered comfort during uncertainty. A failed harvest, illness, or conflict could threaten the entire village. Belief in the gods and the guidance of the Druids helped people make sense of a world that often seemed unpredictable. As darkness settled over the settlement and the festival fires burned brightly, villagers were reminded that they were part of something larger than themselves, a family, a tribe, and a sacred world filled with meaning. Behind the farms, livestock, workshops, and festivals that filled daily life, there was another layer holding the village together: leadership. Every Gaulish village belonged to a larger tribe, and every tribe required people to make decisions, settle disputes, organise defences, and guide the community through difficult times. Life before Rome was not chaotic or lawless, despite what some ancient Roman writers like to suggest. The Romans often described their neighbours as barbarians. Conveniently, they also happened to be planning to conquer them. Historical objectivity occasionally took a back seat when land acquisition was involved. In reality, Gaulish society was highly organised. At the local level, respected elders and influential families played important roles in village affairs. Experience carried weight. Someone who had successfully managed land, raised a family, survived harsh winters, and navigated tribal politics for decades was usually worth listening to. Most of the time, disputes inevitably arose. Arguments over grazing land, livestock ownership, trade agreements, marriage arrangements, or family rivalries could quickly create tension within a community. Left unresolved, small disagreements had a habit of becoming large disagreements involving spears. This was where tribal laws and respected leaders became essential. Druids often acted as judges and mediators, helping settle conflicts before they escalated. Their authority was widely recognised, and their decisions could carry tremendous influence. Above the village level stood tribal chiefs. Some chiefs governed relatively small territories. Others controlled large regions and commanded significant military forces. Their power depended not only on wealth and family connections, but also on their ability to maintain loyalty among warriors and neighbouring communities. Leadership was rarely simple. A chief needed to reward supporters, manage alliances, oversee trade, and prepare for potential conflicts. A poor leader could lose influence quickly. A successful one might unite multiple communities under his authority. Political alliances were constantly shifting. Marriage agreements connected important families. Trade strengthened relationships between tribes. Rivalries sometimes lasted generations. A village might spend years cooperating with a neighbouring tribe, only to find itself competing with them later. News of these developments spread rapidly. Travelling merchants, warriors, and messengers carried information from one settlement to another. Around evening fires, villagers discussed rumours of alliances, disputes, and distant conflicts. Most villagers were far more concerned with their crops and livestock than with high politics. Yet those political decisions could affect everyone. As the sun set behind the forests and another day came to an end, the people of the village rested knowing that their world depended on more than hard work alone. It also depended on leaders capable of keeping peace in an often unpredictable land. As another day ends in the Gaulish village, smoke rises from the rooftops, animals settle into their pens, and families gather around their hearths. To the villagers, life appears steady and familiar. The fields will need tending tomorrow. Livestock will require care. Craftsmen will return to their workshops. Children will learn the same traditions their parents learned before them. The seasons will continue their endless cycle, just as they always have. Or so it seems. The people living in this village have no way of knowing that their world stands on the edge of enormous change. Far to the south, beyond mountains and rivers, another power is growing. Rome. At this moment, the Romans are already expanding their influence across the Mediterranean. Their armies are becoming larger, their roads longer, and their ambitions considerably more difficult for neighbouring peoples to ignore. For now, however, those events feel distant. A Gaulish farmer cares more about next year's harvest than political developments hundreds of miles away. A shepherd worries about wolves, not Roman senators. A blacksmith is concerned with repairing tools, not the strategies of foreign generals. Life continues much as it always has. The village remains the centre of existence. Families know their neighbours. Traditions pass from one generation to the next. Religious festivals mark the passing seasons. Tribal leaders settle disputes and maintain alliances. The forests provide timber, the fields provide grain, and the herds provide wealth. It is a world deeply connected to the land. Unlike the cities that would later spread across Gaul, these communities are built around local relationships and shared customs. Most people rarely travel far from home. Their identity comes from family, tribe, and village, rather than any larger nation. Yet change is already approaching. Long before churches dotted the Irish countryside, and long before monks filled manuscripts with stories of ancient heroes, there were the Druids. To the people of ancient Ireland, Druids were among the most respected and mysterious figures in society. They were not kings, yet kings often listened to them. They were not warriors, yet even powerful warriors hesitated to challenge their authority. They occupied a unique position somewhere between priest, scholar, judge, teacher, historian, and advisor. And because they left almost no written records of their own, much about them remains hidden behind centuries of legend. Imagine arriving in an Irish settlement nearly 2,000 years ago. The village chief oversees daily affairs. Farmers tend their livestock. Craftsmen work at their trades. Yet when an important decision must be made, when a dispute needs settling, or when a sacred ceremony approaches, attention often turns toward the Druid. His words carry weight. His knowledge commands respect, and his memory contains information that entire communities depend upon. Unlike many religious figures in later societies, Druids were not confined to temples or isolated from everyday life. They participated directly in the world around them. They advised rulers, educated students, interpreted laws, and conducted ceremonies tied to the changing seasons. Their influence touched nearly every aspect of life. Ancient writers from the Roman world described Druids as the intellectual elite of Celtic society. Although Roman accounts must be treated carefully, after all, the Romans were not always neutral observers when describing people they intended to conquer. They consistently portray Druids as highly educated individuals with considerable authority. Education was central to their role. A Druid was expected to master enormous amounts of knowledge. Laws, genealogies, religious traditions, poetry, history, and oral literature all had to be memorized. In a society where information was passed down by speech rather than books, memory became a powerful tool. A truly skilled Druid could carry the knowledge of generations inside his mind. Naturally, this made forgetting someone's birthday seem less impressive as a memory achievement. The Druids also occupied a special place within Irish spirituality. They were seen as intermediaries between the human world and the divine. Sacred rituals, festivals, and ceremonies often required their presence. Many people believed druids possessed wisdom that connected them to forces beyond ordinary understanding. Yet for all their prestige, the druids remain elusive. We know they were important. We know they were respected. But much of their world vanished before it could be recorded. What survives today is a mixture of history, tradition, and mystery. And that mystery is precisely what makes the druids so fascinating. If the druids were the intellectual elite of ancient Ireland, they did not achieve that status quickly. Becoming a druid required years of study, discipline, and memorization. In a world without universities, libraries, or printed books, knowledge had to live inside human minds. The druids became the guardians of that knowledge, and training new members of their ranks was one of the most demanding educational systems in the ancient world. The process often began when a young student showed promise. Perhaps he came from a respected family. Perhaps he displayed unusual intelligence or a remarkable memory. Whatever the reason, he would be accepted by an experienced druid and begin a long period of instruction. This was not a short apprenticeship. Roman writers claimed that druidic education could last as long as 20 years. Whether every student studied for quite that long is difficult to know, but the training was undoubtedly extensive. Years passed before a student could be considered fully qualified. The reason was simple. There was an enormous amount to learn. A future druid needed to master laws, tribal histories, genealogies, poetry, religious traditions, rituals, and stories passed down through countless generations. Every important event, family connection, and legal precedent had to be remembered accurately. Mistakes could have serious consequences. Imagine trying to settle a dispute between two powerful families while accidentally forgetting several generations of their ancestry. It was the ancient equivalent of misplacing an important legal document. The druids therefore placed extraordinary importance on memory. Interestingly, much of their knowledge was intentionally not written down. Ancient sources suggest that druids preferred oral transmission. Some believed writing weakened memory. Others may have wished to keep sacred knowledge restricted to those who completed the proper training. Either way, students spent years memorizing vast quantities of information. Lessons were often delivered through verse and poetry. Rhythmic patterns made complex information easier to remember. A student might spend hours repeating passages until they could be recited perfectly from memory. The result was a culture that valued mental discipline above almost everything else. Training was not limited to memorization alone. Students learned how to interpret laws, advise leaders, conduct ceremonies, and understand the traditions of their people. They observed experienced druids at work and gradually absorbed the responsibilities that came with the role. By the time a student completed his education, he was far more than a religious specialist. He had become a living library, a keeper of history, a guardian of tradition. And in a society where knowledge was power, few individuals held greater influence than a fully trained druid. After years of training and memorization, a druid emerged as far more than a scholar. He became a guardian of the sacred. In ancient Ireland, religion was not separated from daily life. The changing seasons, the fertility of the land, the success of harvests, the health of livestock, and the fortunes of kings were all believed to be connected to powerful spiritual forces. The druids stood at the centre of this relationship between humanity and the divine. To ordinary people, the world was filled with mystery. Forests seemed alive with unseen presences. Rivers possessed sacred significance. Certain hills, lakes, and groves were regarded as places where the boundary between worlds grew thinner. The landscape itself carried spiritual meaning, The Druids were expected to understand these sacred connections. They conducted rituals during important festivals that marked the turning of the year. Among the most significant were Samhain, which signalled the beginning of winter, and Beltane, which welcomed the arrival of summer. These celebrations were not simply community gatherings. They carried profound religious importance. During Samhain, many believed the barrier between the living and the supernatural became weaker. Spirits, ancestors, and other worldly beings could move more freely through the world. Fires were lit, ceremonies performed, and offerings made to ensure protection during the dark months ahead. A druid guided these rituals. Without his knowledge, ceremonies risked being performed incorrectly. In a society that viewed proper ritual as essential to maintaining harmony with supernatural forces, this was not a trivial concern. The Druids also served as interpreters of signs and omens. Unusual events in nature could be viewed as messages requiring explanation. A strange storm, an unexpected animal appearance, or an unusual celestial event might prompt people to seek a Druid's wisdom. Human beings have always wanted explanations for uncertain events. The difference was that modern people check weather applications, while ancient Irish villagers consulted Druids. Many traditions associated Druids with sacred groves. These wooded areas were often regarded as holy places where ceremonies could be conducted away from ordinary settlements. Surrounded by ancient trees, participants gathered for rituals that connected communities to their gods, ancestors, and traditions. Because the Druids relied primarily on oral transmission, much of what they taught was never written down. Their sacred knowledge passed directly from teacher to student across generations. This gave the Druids tremendous influence. They preserved beliefs, ceremonies and traditions that helped define Irish society itself. To the people of ancient Ireland, they were more than priests. They were the guardians of a sacred world, ensuring that the wisdom of the past continued to guide the present. While the Druids are often remembered for their religious duties, their influence extended far beyond sacred ceremonies and seasonal festivals. In many ways, they were also the lawyers, judges, and legal scholars of ancient Ireland. Long before written law codes filled shelves and courtrooms became permanent institutions, Irish society relied upon customs that had been passed down through generations. These laws governed everything from property ownership and inheritance to marriage agreements and compensation for injuries. Someone had to remember them. That responsibility frequently fell to the Druids. Ancient Irish society was organised around families, clans, and local kingdoms. Relationships between these groups could become complicated. Land disputes arose. Livestock wandered across boundaries. Trade agreements were broken. Family feuds occasionally escalated into conflicts that threatened entire communities. Not surprisingly, people often disagreed, quite passionately. When such disputes occurred, respected legal experts were needed to interpret traditional laws and determine fair solutions. The Druids possessed the education and authority necessary to perform this role. Their extensive training included learning countless legal precedents and customary practices. Because much of this knowledge was transmitted orally, a Druid needed an extraordinary memory. He had to recall rulings, traditions, family histories, and agreements that might stretch back decades. A person arguing a case before a Druid could not simply hope everyone forgot the details. The Druid usually remembered them. One of the primary goals of Irish law was restoring balance rather than imposing harsh punishment. Instead of filling prisons, which barely existed in the modern sense, many disputes were settled through compensation. If someone caused harm, they might owe livestock, goods, or other forms of payment to the injured party. The objective was often reconciliation. Communities were small, and people had to continue living alongside one another after the dispute ended. Endless cycles of revenge benefited no one, except perhaps the storytellers who enjoyed dramatic material. Druids also advised kings and local rulers. Before making important decisions, a king might consult trusted legal experts to ensure his actions respected established customs. A ruler who ignored tradition risked losing support among both nobles and common people. Law, politics, and religion frequently overlapped. The Druids occupied a unique position at the intersection of all three. Their authority came not from military power, but from knowledge. They commanded no armies, yet even powerful kings often valued their judgment. A wise ruler understood that maintaining legitimacy required more than strength alone. It required respect for tradition. And few people understood those traditions better than the Druids, whose memories preserved the legal foundations of Irish society itself. The Druids preserved religious traditions and interpreted laws, but their responsibilities did not end there. They were also the keepers of memory. In a world where very little was written down, history survived because someone remembered it. The Druids, along with related learned classes such as poets and storytellers, carried enormous amounts of knowledge from one generation to the next. Without them, entire chapters of Irish history could simply disappear. Ancient Ireland placed tremendous value on ancestry. A person's family connections shaped their position in society. Kings traced their lineage back through generations of rulers. Noble families preserved long genealogies that established their rights and prestige. Remembering these family lines was not a casual hobby. It was a serious responsibility. A druid or learned scholar might be expected to recite generations of ancestry from memory. This knowledge helped settle disputes, confirm inheritance rights, and reinforce political alliances. Forgetting an important ancestor could create confusion that lasted for years. The Druids also preserved the stories of the past. Heroes, battles, migrations, legendary rulers, and supernatural events were passed down through carefully maintained oral traditions. Around hearthfires and during great gatherings, these stories connected people to their ancestors and their shared identity. Many of the famous Irish legends known today likely survived because generations of learned men continued to repeat them. Stories of great warriors, magical beings, tragic romances, and heroic deeds travelled across centuries through memory alone. That is a remarkable achievement. Most modern people struggle to remember where they left their keys. The learned classes of ancient Ireland could preserve entire epics. Poetry occupied a particularly important place in this tradition. Poems were more than entertainment. They preserved history, celebrated victories, criticised leaders, and transmitted knowledge. A skilled poet could earn great respect within society. Their words carried influence that extended far beyond simple storytelling. Kings often maintained poets and scholars within their courts. These individuals recorded important events through verse, praised worthy rulers, and sometimes mocked those who deserved criticism. Public ridicule from a respected poet could damage a leader's reputation more effectively than many political rivals. Knowledge itself became a source of power. A druid or scholar who understood history, genealogy, law, and tradition possessed influence that could not be measured in land or wealth. Their expertise helped define what communities remembered about themselves. As centuries passed, Ireland would eventually embrace writing more fully, especially after Christianity arrived. Yet much of the material later recorded in manuscripts had survived only because generations of druids, poets, and scholars carried it in their memories. They were the guardians of Ireland's past, and without them, many of its greatest stories might have been lost forever. For all their roles as teachers, judges, and scholars, the Druids are most often remembered for something else: mystery. Ancient stories frequently portray Druids as figures possessing unusual knowledge and extraordinary abilities. They appear in legends as prophets, advisors, magicians, and intermediaries between the ordinary world and forces beyond human understanding. How much of this was real and how much belongs to legend is difficult to determine. The problem is that most surviving accounts were written centuries after the Druids themselves flourished. By then, history and folklore had become deeply intertwined. Separating one from the other is sometimes like trying to separate mist from the morning air. Nevertheless, these stories reveal how people viewed the Druids, and that perception was powerful. Many believed Druids could interpret signs hidden within the natural world. The flight of birds, unusual weather patterns, dreams, celestial events, and other occurrences might all contain messages requiring interpretation. To the ancient Irish, the world was filled with meaning. Events rarely happened without reason. The Druids' task was to uncover those reasons. Prophecy occupied a special place in these traditions. Legends often describe Druids foretelling the rise of kings, predicting battles, or warning of future disasters. Whether these predictions were genuine prophecies, educated guesses, or stories enhanced through generations of retelling is impossible to know. Ancient storytellers were not always concerned with strict historical accuracy. A dramatic prophecy tends to improve a story considerably. Druids were also associated with blessings and curses. A respected Druid's approval could be sought before important undertakings. Likewise, many feared earning their disfavour. Stories tell of Druids using powerful words to influence events, bring misfortune, or protect communities from harm. Words themselves were believed to possess tremendous power. This belief was hardly unique to Ireland. Across many ancient cultures, spoken language carried spiritual significance. For a highly trained Druid, whose education revolved around memorization and mastery of language, such power seemed entirely plausible. The otherworld featured prominently in Irish tradition as well. This supernatural realm existed alongside the human world and was inhabited by powerful beings, ancestors, and mysterious forces. Druids were often portrayed as individuals capable of understanding or interacting with this hidden dimension. Whether acting as seers, advisors, or ritual specialists, they occupied a position between the known and the unknown. That role fascinated people then, and continues to fascinate people today. Because even after centuries have passed, the image of the Druid remains tied to one enduring idea: the possibility that some mysteries were never fully explained. As respected as the Druids were within villages and communities, their influence became even more apparent in the halls of kings. Ancient Ireland was divided into numerous kingdoms, each ruled by its own leader. Some kings governed small territories, while others controlled larger regions and commanded the loyalty of multiple tribes. Regardless of their power, few rulers operated entirely on their own. A king might carry a sword, a king might command warriors, but a wise king also listened to advice. And some of the most trusted advisors in Ireland were Druids. The relationship between kings and Druids was complex. Druids did not usually rule directly, nor did they command armies. Their authority came from knowledge, tradition, and reputation, rather than military strength. Yet their influence could be enormous. A king seeking guidance before an important decision might consult a Druid. Before entering a conflict, forming an alliance, or settling a dispute, rulers often relied upon individuals whose wisdom was respected throughout the kingdom. In many stories, Druids appear beside kings during crucial moments. They offer counsel, interpret omens, explain traditions, and occasionally deliver warnings that are ignored with predictably unfortunate results. Ancient literature contains numerous examples of rulers suffering because they dismissed wise advice. Apparently, ignoring experts is not an exclusively modern habit. The Druids also played a role in royal ceremonies. Kingship in ancient Ireland was not simply a political office. It carried religious and symbolic significance as well. A ruler was expected to maintain harmony between the people, the land, and the traditions of the kingdom. Ceremonies surrounding the inauguration of kings often involved ritual elements that reflected this sacred responsibility. Druids helped oversee such traditions. Their participation reinforced the legitimacy of the ruler and connected the new king to generations of ancestors who had held power before him. This influence could occasionally create tension. A powerful king might wish to expand his authority, while a respected druid could remind him that tradition imposed limits. Knowledge and power did not always pull in the same direction. Yet most successful rulers understood the value of cooperation. The king provided leadership and protection. The druid provided wisdom and continuity. Together, they helped maintain stability within a society where political alliances were constantly shifting and rival kingdoms competed for influence. Through this partnership, Druids became deeply woven into the political life of ancient Ireland. They were not merely observers standing on the sidelines. They helped shape decisions that affected entire kingdoms. And in a world where a single choice could determine peace or war, the counsel of a druid was often worth listening to very carefully. For centuries, the Druids stood at the centre of Irish religious and intellectual life. They advised kings, interpreted laws, preserved traditions, and guided sacred ceremonies. Their authority seemed deeply rooted in the fabric of society itself. Then a new faith began to arrive. Christianity did not appear overnight, nor did it instantly replace existing beliefs. The transformation of Ireland was gradual, unfolding over generations rather than years. It was a slow process of adaptation, negotiation, and cultural change. Among the figures most associated with this transformation is St. Patrick. According to later tradition, Patrick arrived in Ireland during the 5th century and began spreading Christian teachings throughout the island. Medieval stories often portray dramatic confrontations between Patrick and powerful druids, depicting a struggle between the old religion and the new faith. These tales are fascinating. They are also difficult to verify. Many were written centuries after the events they describe, and often blend history with legend. Still, they reveal how medieval